Hey, this is Joel Duff. Welcome back to my channel. And today I want to, explore this whole squabble that Answers in Genesis and Ken Ham in particular has with a number of other young earth creationists that he believes is undermining young earth creationism, namely those who are what he calls followers of young earth evolution. And I want to do this in a little bit different way because I'm interested in sort of the sociology or I want to do this in a bit of a different way. Rather than talking about the explicit things he has a problem with in terms of young earth evolution, I want to look at it from a perspective from history and a number of other problems that Ken Ham has had with others in young earth creationism in the past. This is a repeating pattern with Ken Ham and those around him who he's basically brought up in his mold. And specifically, I want to go back and I want to look at something that happened at the split between Answers in Genesis and what is now called Creation Ministries International. Now, Answers in Genesis at one point had essentially two CEOs. There was Carl Wieland, who was CEO of Answers in Genesis Australia, which you can think of as kind of the parent company of Answers in Genesis. And then you had Ken Ham, which was the CEO of Answers in Genesis US. Now, Ken Ham originally is from Australia, and he grew up with Carl Wieland. They've been best buds for a long time. And when Ken Ham came to the U.S. and worked for Institute for Creation Research, first as an employee there, but later left them to start his own ministry, although really he's starting it in and under the larger umbrella of the Australian organization. So at this point I should say this is in 2004. Answers in Genesis started earlier than that, but in 2004 the problems began. All right, between the two organizations, the Answers in Genesis Australia division and the Answers in Genesis American division. And in 2004 and all the way up through 2006, there was a number of letters exchanged and different behind-the-scenes discussions between the two organizations and leadership between those two organizations, and eventually percolated out into an all-out, public brawl. And Creation Ministries International was born when basically the Australian group was separated and split off from Answers in Genesis, and Answers in Genesis America became an independent organization with Ken Ham now having complete control. All right, he's the ultimate authority, I guess you could say, of the ministry now, rather than having to share those duties with others in the organization. Now, all of that was a couple-year process, and I have a whole bunch of documents from that period of time. And the reason I have a lot of documents from that period of time in terms of like the timeline of what happened and what letters were sent and who said what in many cases is because the very nascent group of Creation Ministries International, when they rebranded themselves, they had a primitive website, their first website, and on that website they were very public about their dispute with being cut off from Answers in Genesis and feeling they had been wronged in terms of their research journal being hidden from the American audience. And there was a number of other things, but a lot of it comes down to, some things in personalities and so forth. It's just like all organizations, not just, all secular organizations, especially nonprofits, will have disgruntled employees and differences of opinions. That's to be expected. But what's of interest here is the specific role of Ken Ham in the division that occurred and how really this shows a pattern of divisiveness that he has been a part of since very early on, from his very beginnings in Australia. There's actually a number of different people who have split off from him there, and then coming to ICR, and then coming to his own, coming to work for his own group with Carl Wieland in America, and then eventually splitting with them, and then a number of different squabbles with other young earth creationists up until the present. And now we see this continued sort of pattern of calling out others and trying to pare away many other young earth creationists from the fold. And really, and for what reason? That's what we're going to look at, because I'm going to show you a specific document that Creation Ministries International, I kind of got distracted. So Creation Ministries International published all those documents on their website. And so, of course, I downloaded all those, and I have copies of all those things, including a few things from Answers in Genesis. And I want to just show one document today, and I'm just going to read a portion of it. And it has to do with the perceived problems at Answers in Genesis by those who were being kicked out of Answers in Genesis. And I want to, suggest that the problems that were raised there, and we're going to talk about quotes from things that were said, not just speculations and people that have complained or hearsay that I've heard, but these are written down things that have been part of that dispute that I am telling the tale of right now. And, I don't do this lightly, because I've had these documents for a long time, and I rarely actually discuss them and talk about them, even though I think they form an opinion. They form a very important part of my own understanding of the inner workings of young earth creationist organizations, and so reflect some of the things that I have said that have been criticisms of them, but I haven't explicitly talked about some of these claims. So this will be kind of the first time I do that. And again, this is precipitated by Ken Ham's recent sort of diatribe against, say, Todd Wood and others that are these, what he calls young earth evolutionists, but I'm calling the new creationist. All right, so let's just get right to it. So here's the document I want to share with you. It's called the Chairman's Report on the 2007 Brees Committee of Inquiry. This was at a point in 2007, so this is well beyond the actual division of the Answers in Genesis and Answers in Genesis Australia, and the group from Australia, along with some members that were still in the United States, because now Creation Ministries International is based in Georgia, so in the United States, and they had set up shop there, but they're still in a dispute with Answers in Genesis, and they wanted certain recognition from them about some things that they perceived had been done incorrectly, and wanted some financial compensation as well. And there was a lawsuit that then ensued. All right, so Creation Ministries International essentially sued Answers in Genesis, and that case played out eventually in a settlement out of court, in which both parties agreed not to talk about it. So we don't really know exactly what happened and how an agreement was reached. However, before the agreement was reached, Creation Ministries International publicized, made it very public, their particular grievances with Answers in Genesis, and provided documentation for those grievances. Here's the evidence, and here is what we said and why we said it, and so forth. At the same time, Answers in Genesis was essentially quiet, rarely mentioning this on their webpage, and essentially trying to shield their audience from this dispute, and eventually, as I said, settled out of court. So it just kind of never made it to many people. Many people never even knew that there was this split, other than, hey, there's a new organization out there, Creation Ministries International. But during this time in which there was this dispute and there was this court case that was going to begin, you can think of this as like an independent counsel, independent investigator who looked at the situation and drew up a report and an opinion about what transpired in this particular split between these organizations, and wrote this 40-page document, which I'm going to just show you a few little snippets from. All right, so Claire Brees, who is the person that wrote up this document, was formerly the chief magistrate of the state of New South Wales, and so basically has lawyering capacity, right? And took a look at the evidence, and he writes it up in essentially a kind of a legal brief as to his findings about the relationship of Answers in Genesis and Creation Ministries International at that point. So let me just skip down here to page 5. The executive summary is really interesting, but I'm not going to read all that for you. We're just going to get down to the parts about that I think will help you understand the mindset of Ken Ham and those at Answers in Genesis, because that's really what we're getting at here. Okay, let's go back to 2004. And what he does in the first few pages here is he is outlining the history of events that occurred. There's a bunch of other documents from Creation Ministries International that have this simplified, but I think it's worth reading a little section of this in this particular report. Visit to the U.S. by Australians. By this time, 2004, I really wasn't aware of this issue until around 2006. So this was all behind the scenes at this time. There had been a number of visitors in the U.S. from Answers in Genesis Australia, in addition to Gary Bates, that saw certain things, as did Bates, about Answers in Genesis USA and its operations, which they viewed with concern. All right, so there was a growing concern within Answers in Genesis, the broad, worldwide group of Answers in Genesis. In a letter to the U.S. board dated 18th of August, 2004, right, and he has that document appended to this particular thing here, this report, supporting reform proposals put forward by Carl Wieland. Now, Carl Wieland was the other CEO, the CEO of Answers in Genesis Australia. All right, so they sent a letter to Answers in Genesis US, essentially Ken Ham, right, proposing a series of reforms for Answers in Genesis. And Batten, Sephardi, right, who's also with Creation Ministries today, Sparrow and Walker, which are lesser known individuals, but nonetheless, all these individuals from Answers in Genesis Australia summarize their concerns as follows. All right, so now here's the summary of what were they concerned about? What was their reason for suggesting some reforms? All right, the growth of the number of staff running the U.S. ministry. This includes what seems to be an overly large number of vice presidents and managers in proportion to those directly involved in getting the message out. All right, who's actually involved in spreading the word of God? All right, doing the apologetics ministry, and who are just vice presidents and managers, all right, behind the scenes. This requires a considerable amount of supporters' funds, all right. There's a huge emphasis on having to need a lot of support in order to just keep this organization going, much less putting money in the hands of people that are actually spreading the word and spreading the word of young earth creationism. Right. We've seen a subtle shift in the focus from proclaiming the message, all right? In other words, getting it to the grassroots Christians in the pews, to promoting Answers in Genesis and their broader, bigger mission, which now include, of course, at this particular time, included getting the Creation Museum off the floor. All right, then we have the number of staff casualties on the U.S. ministry, with people being sidelined or terminated. Right, and this was a big issue at this time, especially coming up at the Creation Museum. It appears there was some internal discussions and disagreements about the merits of spending so much money on a museum versus the other works that had been going on. And so there's, this again, it happens in all organizations, right? Somebody has to decide the direction you're going to go in. Some people don't like that direction. So yes, some people are sidelined and terminated. I don't necessarily find a fault with that. While others resigned through burnout or just carry on despite their poor morale. We've had various staff members share their concerns about poor staff morale. This hasn't changed. There's lots of stories of people at Answers in Genesis that are poorly paid, overworked, and sort of berated and told that they're doing this ministry for God, and that's always an excuse for not really adequately compensating them for it, right? The ministry in the U.S. is far too dependent on one person. Now, here's where we're going to get to what I think is really one of the big issues, and it's still a big issue, which makes it extremely vulnerable compared to the apologetics ministry of Answers in Action, run by Bob and Gretchen Passatino. Bob was almost exactly Ken's age, but dropped dead of a heart attack last year. Their ministry has been devastated. It seems to us that Answers in Genesis US is becoming more and more focused or dependent on one person and is in a very vulnerable position. That hasn't changed, except that Ken Ham is another 15 years older. And so it has the concern should be even greater today than it was in the past. It is top heavy toward one person, and it is a personality-driven organization. A related issue to this is that the U.S. ministry alone seems to have been reluctant to develop other speakers, scientists, and leaders who can provide the apologetics engine for the ministry, as well as spreading the message by going church to church. It's not just a matter of broadening the support base, but primarily a way of countering the false teaching of the likes of Hugh Ross, and who has been effectively filling the vacuum in the churches that Answers Genesis is not reaching. Interesting point, right? That they recognize that Hugh Ross is, his popularity is growing, and Old Earth Creationist is growing and is filling this void where we're not reaching far enough into the local churches. Now, again, where Answers in Genesis has gone since then is, yes, he'll say he's hired a few scientists, but let's face it, it's culture wars, it's having a school, it's the Ark Encounter now, which didn't even exist as probably an idea at this point, or a very nascent idea, because it was really about the Creation Museum at this point in time. And so, yes, Ken Ham has turned this into a people come to us and we will, give them the word here. And there is less and less and less emphasis on sending out speakers. And they have a much smaller speakers bureau than they had before. And they're doing many fewer events in other places. And that's a decision that an organization can make. And that's a direction they've decided to go. But that does make them different than some of the other creation ministries. Okay, so just two more things. We're not going to go through all, don't worry, we're not here to go through all 40 pages. I just want to get through the next page, really. Item 4 was the problem perceived by them as causing and still causing the greatest concern. What was item number 4? The ministry is dependent on Ken Ham. A U.S. Skeptics website on 2007 noted that AIG looks to be very weak. They're completely dependent on the health of Ken Ham. Without him, the ministry would completely collapse. And that's still a big question for today, is what will happen when Ken Ham's not there. All right. Now, they have been working pretty hard to try to establish, what Ken Ham is doing right now. And what he has done is, I think I talked on This Week in Creationism 6 months ago or so. They've re-updated their statement of faith and made all these different commitments. They've put new checks and balances in place in order for, essentially what they've done is he's tried to make it really hard to change anything that has happened at Answers in Genesis and change the direction of Answers in Genesis in the future. What he's trying to do is make sure that when he's gone, somebody else can't come in and shift the focus and maybe change some of their views at all. It'll be really hard to do that because of some of the things he's put into place to do that. So he's trying to make sure that change is not really possible, when he's not around. Now we get to the biggie. Proposals for reform of Creation Ministries. Having regard to the actions taken by Ken Ham and the U.S. ministry in the Canadian controversy, or this has to do with Gary Batten, who was referenced earlier, who was in charge of the Answers in Genesis in Canada, and there was growing separation there. And the growing concerns of Wieland and his colleagues about Answers in Genesis USA in relationship to other matters, it's not surprising that Carl Wieland, anxious about the health and well-being of Creation Ministries generally, Carl Wieland's a little bit, slightly older than Ken Ham, and he is, in a way, one of the fathers of young earth creationism and the whole development of young earth creationism in Australia, which eventually imports to the U.S. in the form of Ken Ham. Not that, of course, it existed here because of Henry Morris and so forth, but Carl Wieland's a really big, important person in all this that you probably don't know his name as well. And there's actually a reason for that, because he realizes that a cult of a single person being the person that everyone recognizes and listens to can be a problem for an organization. And so he has intentionally not lifted himself up to that point, whereas every one of you knows Ken Ham's name. It's natural they would take steps to bring those concerns to the attention of Ken Ham and the U.S. board. Right? They have a board that oversees Ken Ham, although that board has been At this point during this purge, they also purge certain members of the board and other members of the organization who aren't totally loyal to Ken Ham. So they're just a rubber stamp at this point. Furthermore, to refrain to act in these circumstances would almost certainly bring down upon his head deserved censure if the situation were to deteriorate further. The actions that he took, Carl Wieland took, and the proposals he made were of the kind that responsible members of a secular organization used to put administration structures on a sound footing in democratic societies everywhere. What this lawyer is saying is like, what Carl Wieland's going to suggest as reforms and things that the organization should be doing in order to protect itself in its future are just generally sound business principles, all right? And any organization should want to do these things if they want to secure their future. For that reason, no doubt what he planned to do was not something the Australian board at that time disapproved of. They're like, yeah, these are good ideas. These are things that we all need to be in constant reform and making sure that we are protecting the future of the organization. As indicated by their willingness for him to express his concerns and proposals in the two-part letter they vetted prior to sending. So this is a letter that Carl Wieland wrote as CEO of Answers in Genesis Australia, and the board there takes that letter, vets it, gives it the seal of approval. Yes, let's send this off to the board in the U.S. The Wieland proposals are so obviously beneficial for the administration of any organization, there would be very few, if any, secular or church bodies who would object to the introducing reforms of that kind. Let's take a look at what happens then. All right, so you send off that letter. Hey, here's some things that we ought to consider for the health of this organization. On the 13th of August in 2004, with the Australian board's encouragement, a telephone conversation between Wieland and Ham took place. All right, I presume this is after they've received this letter. Wieland's part in the conversation was recorded and later transcribed. Right, so we have the transcript. We know what Carl Wieland said in this particular conversation. Some extracts. All right, so here's quotes. Here's are things that Carl Wieland, CEO of Answers in Genesis Australia, said to his equal partner at the time, Ken Ham, Answers in Genesis CEO from the United States. The aim for both of us to fix the problem between us. I've sensed that I've been on the outer and basically past my use-by date as far as you're concerned. You seem to be done with me, despite all the things we've been through over 25 years. And that's maybe an over-the-top statement, but a simple summary of it for probably 1 to 2 years. That problem has been escalating since that time, and somehow I feel you're threatened by me, and I don't understand why. What I mean is, if you look at the function of the ministry, the massive amount of money spent, the massive amount of staff spent, and the very little by proportion that comes out of it apart from you, in other words, that the production and the end result, the stuff that has to do with the ministry, with apologetics, as in relevant speaking, publications, writing, all sorts of things, leaving the museum to a side, which the team is working really well on. So he's trying to say, yes, this museum thing seems to be well organized. Bottom line is an immensely top-heavy organization. All right, so this is his impression that the American organization is really top-heavy. And of course, with the heaviest piece at the top, Ken Ham. Ken, I've never seen anything more obvious. And I am not the only person in the world who thinks that the whole thing is heading in the direction of Ken Ham Ministries rather than Answers in Genesis. That's the bottom line. You asked me years ago to tell you when I thought you had a pride and ego problem. And I think now that time has come. All right, so here's the CEO of Answers in Genesis Australia is saying, growing up when we weren't big shots, we promised to each other we would tell each other when we've gotten too big for ourselves, right? Our heads, our pride has gotten in the way of us, right? We have an ego. We're bigger than we think. We're more important than we think. And we promised each other we'd tell each other when that time came. Well, the time's here now, all right? You are too much in control of the organization. And you're not allowing others to actually have important jobs and do important things. All right. Besides, you're doing all the firing, you're doing all the hiring, you're setting all the rules. It is Ken Ham Ministries. You can't really call it Answers in Genesis as this, group of Christians that are making decisions. You make all the decisions. None of this has really changed. Ken Ham actually isn't a CEO anymore, but it kind of doesn't matter. I mean, the CEO is just the day-to-day operations guy, and so forth. He's still going to take his cue from Ken Ham. All right, let's continue. There's all this marketing money flow, big glitz and glamour and corporate high-flying stuff. Cam, it is 5 vice presidents. I mean, what, $500,000, in salary alone? For what? To do what? To generate what? Apart from this museum thing. Right? This is the perception of Answers in Genesis. Australia looking at Answers in Genesis and the direction they're going back in 2004. You can't really imagine they would think much differently today, given where Answers in Genesis has gone in terms of becoming this big runner of amusement parks as their central operating scheme. Anybody who is allowed to look into it from the outside and not just see the image, the glittering image, can see that there's huge wastage, Ken, every one of our guys that's been over there has seen the culture. And I'm not talking about the U.S. culture. I'll tell you straight. All the guys who have been there have at some level or other sensed that there is a massive hierarchical, unhealthy corporate atmosphere. It's all geared to the big guy at the top. Now, I mean, Ken Ham's response and others' response to this, of course, is probably going to be like, you're jealous, you can do all the types of tactics, right, that Ken Ham uses to disparage his opponents. He's going to end up using about Creation Ministries International and others who are split off from him. Every time one of our guys go over there, the people sit down and pour their hearts out. And I'm talking junior people about how harassed they feel and how they feel pressured and how unfair this is and that is. There is not a healthy, open atmosphere. You have a habit of writing people off. Once they're written off, then everything from there on, they cannot do right. We saw it with so many people. I mean, that's what's happening. Once Ken Ham decides that you're not on God's side on this issue, then you are written off. You're not simply a Christian who has a different viewpoint, but who is earnestly struggling to try to understand. And we can, it's evil, right? It's bad. This is what's happening today with the way he's talking about other young earth creationists. Take Gary Bates, all right, who's at Creation Ministries International today. Instead of being willing to see that could have been a help in a few areas, he's now written off. You've poisoned the well. Professor Randall Short begged me at the beginning of my tenure. He said, Carl, look at what's happening with John McKay and Ken Ham. That's a whole big fiasco in Australia between two former friends as well. Please don't build this up as a person. And I worked like crazy to make sure of that, and I'm glad I did. Carl Wieland, and I've watched Carl Wieland's career, I would say has done a good job of basically being supportive and using multiple people in his organization, just like Creation Ministries International does today. Can you name me, who's the big kahuna at Creation Ministries International? Who's the one that's really running the show? I mean, they have a CEO, but do I associate Creation Ministries International with one person? Absolutely not. It's definitely a group effort, right? Make group decisions. One person at the end of the day is making some decisions, but they're not also the incredibly public face of the organization. Can hundreds of thousands, right, referring to monetary savings, could be saved every year, hundreds of thousands, and I'm concerned of it. And that's why I'm just waiting, wanting the chance to demonstrate. But what I'm afraid of, and please prove me wrong, is that you won't be able to handle that because you will see this as a personal failure. I'm begging you, put that to one side for the sake of the ministry. Of course, Ken Ham's not going to do that. He is not going to do that. All right. So what does Chairman Brees say about, these comments, all right, these actual transcripts of the conversation in which he's saying this straight to Ken Ham's face, right? And I think more than just Ken Ham, the board. This telephone conversation reveals that relationships between the two men were not as warm as the close relationships as they once were. Wieland doesn't shrink from raising the concerns and those of his colleagues, telling Ken Ham what he and his senior Australian staff members who visited America really think. But he does thus in a civil and courteous manner. Okay, and then there's some history about how right after this, the second command at Answers in Genesis is fired because he actually takes up some of these concerns and thinks maybe some are valid, they should do something about it. So boom, you're out. Ken Ham fires him. Well, the board fires him, but that's Ken Ham firing him. So a bunch of other stuff happens, right? So these are all things that are happening mostly behind the scenes at this time. And one of the reasons you don't hear about it is because, like, his right hand, they're basically buying people out, and then they're doing what a lot of corporations and other people do, which is they buy their silence, basically pay them off, which is why you won't hear a lot of people talking about these things. Now, last thing. I want to do this last little bit here. Strategies used by Ken Ham in disputes, and this is the whole reason I'm bringing this up, and how I want to relate it to exactly what Ken Ham is doing today and show that he hasn't changed. This is who Ken Ham is, and we can say that because we have lots of evidence. All right, this is not just speculation. We've seen this pattern over and over and over and over again. Where there's smoke, there's fire. And actually, there's fire here, not just smoke. The fire is right here. To identify and appreciate the motivation which produced unethical actions of the kind used by Ken Ham and the USA, AiG-USA, it's important to see them from the perspective of what Ken Ham, supported by his board, did in other disputes and controversies between the parties where Ken Ham's power or influence was threatened. There is a common pattern. I've seen this pattern. All right, and I've talked about this pattern before in the past. And we see this pattern play out over and over and over again. So what are those strategies? Where an action is taken or a proposal made, which Ken Ham perceives to be a threat to his position of dominance, power, influence in the creationist movement, it will trigger action by Ken Ham and or the U.S. board to counter-eliminate the threat. He'll take his board, which he'll say is like, this group of, smart people who are able to, judge and guide this organization. So it's not just Ken Ham, but they're all those who Ken Ham has carefully selected and essentially are trying to avoid using certain terms of like mind, right? There's not a lot of diversity of opinion among them. All right, so that's one thing. You're going to use the board, and I will also toss in there that also includes using lawyers, right? They're really good at lawyering up and sending out notices and scare tactics and that kind of stuff. I mean, I've received stuff from Answers in Genesis lawyers in the past, warning about saying certain things or revealing certain information and so forth, right? It's just something that is just like they take it right out of the secular playbook, right? It's like, they're a corporate. They have a group of corporate lawyers to protect the corporation. Secondly, criticism and denigration of the person or organization responsible for the threat is usually a feature of that action. Absolutely. All right? heaping on criticism, denigrate them. Well, really what it is like it's saying things like that they're so-called Christians. That person is undermining the authority of Scripture. They're doing this and that. They're basically saying, they're calling into question their Christian bona fides, making them sound like they're working against the kingdom of God, trying to separate them, isolate them from the organization, and so that their followers who are donating money will view them as bad people, right? Rather than trying to work out disputes. All action deemed necessary, expedient, to remove, punish, destroy, neutralize the person's organizational responsibilities for the threat will be taken by Ken Ham and his board. All right, actually, that's the whole lawyerly thing right there. Biblical ethical considerations will sometimes be ignored or not allowed to stand in the way of actions to be taken. Strategy number 3. Right? This pattern of behavior appears in the dispute rising out of Gary Bates' tour of Canada and the U.S. back in December of 2003. So he goes through and, he's talking about, okay, you can see this pattern of behavior in that. How did Ken Ham react to these? Very poorly, all right? Has all these different letters and things that Ken Ham has done, or where Ken Ham said certain things, but at the same time, they have evidence, they have the proof. I mean, they have a lot of evidence that at the same time he's telling Carl Wieland and other things one thing, he's telling his board to circumvent and go around and, make sure you're starting to do things like remove certain documents and move things over in places where this other part of the organization can't see it or get to them. And that's part of why eventually they sue, that Creation Ministries International has to sue Answers in Genesis, because they basically exclude them from getting kind of like intellectual resources that they were part of generating and feel like they had the rights to and should continue to have the rights to. And they basically had to fight to get those some of those rights back. Alrighty, so like I said, oh boy, this thing goes on and on and on and on, and there's tons and tons of quotes and other things and stories about what happened in this whole 2-year saga happening. Eventually, you can see from the language here that Chairman Breeze is supportive of Creation Ministries International's position, sort of sides on their side. Now, this supposedly, as it says here, unsolicited by CMI, and I call it kind of an independent investigation, but I don't have any doubts there was some bias toward feeling like CMI probably had a case before he started. That doesn't necessarily change the fact that they actually did have a case and that he uncovered that evidence for that and portrays it accurately in this report. And that's part why I'm mostly just reading you some of the quotes from things rather than just opinion, although I read you some opinion from Breeze. All right, so where does that lead us? I just wanted to read that to you today because I think maybe it helps give you some perspective about the fact that Ken Ham has consistently run into or has consistently been divisive in a way. Now, I know that, once again, I will say that like all organizations have disputes, all right? Besides, creation, Answers in Genesis is made up of a collection of sinners, right? They're not perfect. But even in organizations, every organization has imperfect people and has people that are working with different motivations. And so there's always going to be conflict. But putting the right procedures in place and recognizing, and I think it's even more important in a Christian organization to recognize the sin of pride and of ego and to do whatever you can to try to avoid those things happening. I mean, after all, this is what is plaguing the church right now in terms of mega churches with popular pastors. These pastors grow to the point where they no longer can be told anything about where they're wrong because they feel threatened. And they will constantly justify all their own actions in their own mind, what they make right what they think. And they may not have started out that way. They may have started out really with a heart in the right place and a right attitude, and believing that they will listen to advice, right? They will listen to critique. but at some point you lose the ability to be critiqued. And what do we see? We see that so many of these leaders, fall astray, right? They do things that you might not imagine as your younger self ever being capable of doing because of the power that comes along with being in control of such a large organization, which is why Creation Ministries International has a more dispersive model, and it's by design because part of it might be there's no single charismatic person there that has been able to sort of gain enough popularity that they can be the face of Creation Ministries International. I guess what I'm saying, it's a complex, nuanced topic. But because it's a complex topic, because there can be so many different variables, Ken Ham can even use the complexity of that to basically shift the blame to other things, right? You can always say, well, that's not my fault. It's these people, they're saying the wrong things about it. They don't really understand, or, and I'm sure he believes he's doing the best thing and the right thing, and he is God's, minister to the world. And it's just really hard for him to pivot. And Ken Ham and other leaders like him become kind of caricatures of themselves. They've said certain things so many times, and they have been so adamant about certain things for so long that they become the voice for certain issues. And that makes it, even if they had a moment in their life where they looked in the scriptures and they read a commentary and they really allowed themselves to think through a particular topic and really say, I'm not actually that sure about that. I might be wrong. Can they even say that out loud? If they say that out loud, donors, are up in arms, and people are like, what's going on? And, they're the savior for a lot of people. They're the one that sets their confidence. I have confidence because Ken Ham continues to say the same thing, and that gives me confidence. And so even when leaders get to the point where they may have internal struggles, and they may even wish to be able to shift and adapt and change themselves and come to a better understanding of something, right? A more nuanced view of something, they almost can't do it. I actually find myself sometimes sorry for people who are so well known that they can't actually change, because to change would be to destroy their own reputation, and that then becomes impossible to do. I hope this was kind of helpful to see the psychology of this organization, and maybe helps you understand why Answers in Genesis is the way it is. And why so many people that work at Answers in Genesis really don't get along with members at other groups and other organizations, right? There's a lot of conflict, a lot of disagreement. And sometimes it's not their fault. There are employees at Answers in Genesis, so I'm sure you really desire to work with other young earth creationists and have conversation with them and wrangle over tough topics. But in a way, Ken Ham doesn't really even allow that. It's a very restrictive environment. And besides, other organizations and employees there don't really have a whole lot of love, right, for Ken Ham. And therefore, his employees are tainted by the opinion of others about Ken Ham. And so this is just the way human nature works. And it's not surprising or shocking. But you would think that they should be able to do better than this. And this is why Ken Ham is a blessing and a curse to young earth creationism. He's a blessing because, unlike Creation Ministries International, which I just said doesn't have a really, charismatic, out front popularizer, and that's a problem because it makes it harder for them to generate funds. Right? It makes it harder for them to get their word out and become more effective in that sense. Whereas Ken Ham has that, right? He has that draw. And so that's a blessing because that does then draw in all this money. But drawing all that money in then also comes with the consequences of all the different negatives that come with having a cult of personality, right? Including you have a massive top-heavy edifice, lots of infrastructure costs at Answers in Genesis. They just bought a huge new building, multi-million-dollar building to run IT and television out of, and a school. And you got the Ark Encounter, and you have the Creation Museum. There's a huge amount of just basic infrastructure cost, and it doesn't all pay for itself in terms of like generating products that generate income. It's more donations. They still rely on donations. People have to want to just give money because they think this is something that is a valuable service, right, to Christianity. And without Ken Ham being the one that's really pulling in those dollars, they're going to have trouble just maintaining infrastructure when he's no longer the voice. I think it'll be kind of like Ligonier Ministries, right? With R.C. Sproul. All right? And, R.C. Sproul was I will say charismatic voice. He was a really good speaker, and people want to hear him. And he had an organization that had lots of other individuals. Some were really smart. Some were pretty good speakers. But none of them could get out of the shadow of R.C. Sproul. And then now Ligonier Ministries still exists today, and I still get their, YouTube videos like every day. They have a couple YouTube videos, get a newsletter and a variety of things. And what's always on all of them, it's usually a message from R.C. Sproul. It's like a piece of old video of R.C. Sproul, right? Even though they have other people there, I see more R.C. Sproul than I do anything else, because they can't escape from that particular charismatic leader who really is the driving force of that whole organization. And they've never been able to sort of capture a vision that doesn't still include him at the center and face of it. And I'm sure that's what happened with Answers in Genesis. I mean, when Ken Ham can no longer be the physical, literal voice of Answers in Genesis, we will still have videos and clips and articles that will be regenerated, revamped, and we'll send out requests for donations with quotes from Ken Ham and videos from Ken Ham. And by that time, we're going to have deep fake videos, and we're going to have, right? Yes, we're going to have Ken Ham is still always going to be, 60 years old, and will still be, talking to us 50 years after he's dead, the way technology works today. But I still don't think that's going to be as effective as having the actual Ken Ham around. And so that's a problem for Answers in Genesis going forward. All right. Let's stop there. Yep. All right. Have a great day. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.